If someone in prison wrote you a letter, would you read it? Of course you would. I think that I would be super interested if I got a letter from anyone in prison, just for curiosity. This book, Philippians, is just that. Paul wrote a letter from prison, and we have the ability to read it. This is going to be a little bit of the backstory of Paul, but then I'm going to show you something in Philippians chapter 1 that I find really interesting. Paul was a person who was persecuting other Christians. He was having them arrested. He was killing Christians. This was part of his way of life for a long time, but something happened. He met Jesus, and he was forgiven, and he was given this new life, and he spent the rest of his life with one goal, with one purpose, and that was to advance the gospel, this good news. He wanted other people to know that anyone could be forgiven, that this grace was for everyone, Jew, Gentile, anything, young or old, rich or poor. He had one purpose, is to get people to understand that they can be forgiven. And Paul had been forgiven for so much. And after he became a believer and a Christ follower, he began to go around different places, and he ended up leaving Jerusalem and Israel. He ended up going into Europe, into a place called Philippi, which was kind of a Roman city, had about, 10 or 15,000 people, if I remember correctly. And it was a stop on Paul's journey, his second missionary journey. And as he stopped in Philippi, he kind of shared the good news with a girl named Lydia, and she was converted. She became a Christian, and she actually was the first European to ever become a Christ follower. And he baptized her right there, which I've been to that spot. It was super cool. But later in the story, you'll see, and I believe this is Acts chapter 16, you'll see that Paul gets arrested in Philippi. And this is the one where, as he's in prison, he's hanging out with his buddies, and there was an earthquake that came, and the jailer thought that they had escaped. But to his surprise, Paul was still sitting there, and he was relieved, of course. And this was all part of the early kind of the movement of Christianity that was happening. And this was where Paul started a church. Now, I'm not talking about like a building with stained glass and steeples. What I'm talking about is a gathering of believers who had one purpose, and that was to grow in the faith together. And about 10 years later, he is in a different location, and he gets thrown in prison again. It was a common thing, actually. And he writes a letter from prison to Philippi, the church that met in Philippi, and he is telling them some things that are very, very important. And the book of Philippians, there's 4 chapters. I'm going to point out a couple of things that I find really, really fascinating. Verse 12, he says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." There was one thing that Paul was passionate about, and that was advancing the gospel. And as he's sitting in prison, he's thinking about life and all of the suffering that he's gone through. Because at this point, he had been shipwrecked and snake bit, and he's been beaten, and he's been tortured and run out of town in all sorts of different ways. He's been in prison, I don't know how many times. And he comes to this one thought that I find fascinating. And to be honest, this is one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. And it's this right here. It's Philippians 1, verse 21. "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And the next verse, "If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which shall I choose? I cannot tell." Verse 23, "I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better." These 3 verses are unbelievable. If you grasp this, he says, for me to live is Christ. I have one purpose. I don't care about anything. My whole purpose is for Christ. To the point where he says, for me to live is Christ. That is unbelievable. He had been saturated with this idea of being in Christ, to the point where all life was summed up in one word. For me to live is Christ. Every single part of him came back to one purpose, and it was all one thing, and it was Christ. To die was gain, because he gets to be with Christ in heaven, in eternity, forever, and the suffering would be would be gone. It would be no more. But he realizes he has to go through the suffering, and it was a privilege for him to go through suffering, to the point where he's sitting in prison writing a letter to other people saying, hey, for me to live is Christ. So Paul is rich with these thoughts, with this understanding of truth, and he wants to take this and give it to other people, hoping that other people will read this letter and that will kind of cycle around other places that he had visited, which did happen. But this letter, Paul's letter to the Philippians, it's really about joy. He talks about joy. That subject is 14 times in this book alone of only 4 chapters. He brings up joy and talks about rejoicing 14 times. And he says in verse 27, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. He's hoping that you will live a life that's worthy of the gospel of Christ. He's saying that he wants us to be in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. Before I get into verse 28, you got to know that this whole life that we live is not a playground, but it's a battleground. And you're going to hear some language, this striving side by side. I picture that as like soldiers side by side, advancing the gospel forward. We're talking about this in a spiritual sense, not physically out there fighting. We're talking about spiritually. We're fighting in the spiritual realm to push the gospel forward, because it is the hope. It is everything. And in verse 28, he says, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is the clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. What is this suffering talking about? I mean, living here on earth, this place is full of suffering, and it's difficult. The alternative is once we exit here, we're going to be without suffering. But right now, it's a privilege to be able to share with Christ in his sufferings, to bring other people into the kingdom. And that's what he's talking about. It's not going to be easy, so get ready. And the last verse right here, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Remember when he was in Philippi, they saw the conflict that Paul had. He was thrown in prison. He was run out of town. They were trying to beat him. They were trying to torture him. He says, that same that you saw while I was there, I'm still dealing with it. It's been 10 years later, I'm still dealing with it. But he says, you're going to be engaged in the same type of conflict. For us, it doesn't mean that we're all going to be thrown in prison. It doesn't mean that. It's probably not certain that you're going to be thrown into prison, but it could happen. But what he wants is a couple of things from us. One, we have to live that manner of life that's worthy of the gospel, which means you have to have good character. And the second one is we have to be in community with people, in the faith community. That's what this is written to, not just a person. This is written to a faith community, and we're a part of that. So having good character, integrity, like living that life that's worthy, that manner of life in community, and having the confidence in God, having confidence against the enemy, confidence that Jesus has already won the war. Yes, we're in a battle, but we're fighting from victory, not for victory. Jesus already won. Death on the cross, that resurrection from the dead, he's conquered sin and he's conquered death. So we are fighting in a spiritual sense from victory, and we're here to advance the gospel. And that's the point of getting us started right here in Philippians chapter 1.